Imagine it's September 1914, and the world was just plunged into the chaos of World War I, and a pivotal battle is about to unfold in the cold, unforgiving terrain of East Prussia. The fate of empires and thousands of lives are at stake. This is the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes. If you're not a history buff, you're not alone. I hadn't heard of this battle until just a few weeks ago. So what actually happened? This was a war between the Russian and the German armies. It was between late August and early September of 1914, just at the beginning of World War I. It took place in East Prussia, which is right here, and now northern Poland, northeastern Poland, you could say. This was the second defeat for the Russian army at the hands of the Germans. It's often overshadowed by the larger and more impressive Battle of Tannenberg, which also occurred just before this, also in East Prussia, and was another significant victory for the Germans over the Russians.
Hey there class, my name is Braden and as my partner Rori mentioned, our project is over the First Battle at the Masurian Lakes on the Eastern Front. While Rori briefly introduced and discussed the conflict, it is crucial for us to know why we should care. Reason 1, the battle served as an in-between turning point in the Eastern Front. Reason 2, it gave the Germans a valiant victory early in the war. And reason 3, the Russian defeat led to many temporary setbacks and left them at a disadvantage with the rest of the war. So now I will be discussing a lot of the contributing factors and context and events that led up to the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. That is definitely worth knowing and mentioning. As I provide my verbal synopsis, I have a summary here up on the screen, and I will have a couple maps posted that I'll be referring to as well. So as we briefly discussed in class last week, German leaders such as Schlieffen and Moltke, they were definitely aware of the two-front war they faced, that the German Empire faced in the west and the east, though they were much more concerned with France and did not really view Russia as great of a threat due to their own internal political unrest and conflicts, as we end up seeing with the revolutions and all that. So as a result, Germany sent 7 of their armies west while only leaving 1 behind to defend the Eastern Front. The German Empire didn't really have all the necessary extra regular and reserve corps to perform extensive strategic maneuvers without opening themselves to risk at the time. So, when it came to Germany's prior invasion of Belgium in the west, they had planned the added advantage of stationing German troops near the railroad hubs, which we have pictures of somewhere in our presentation here, in West Germany for easy transfer back and forth between the two fronts. As the Russian invasion was expected according to the Schlieffen plan preferences. Both Schlieffen and Moltke predicted they would quickly cripple the French in the west and then be able to regroup and meet up with the defense back in the east. On the other side of the campaign, in this northern theater, Russia initially had the size advantage over Germany, deploying its 1st and 2nd armies. Had these forces fully concentrated on the offense in East Prussia as planned, they could have caught the Germans by surprise and overwhelmed the 8th Army, potentially opening up the door to Berlin. However, due to administrative and operational mistakes and disputes between its generals, which I will be talking about in detail here shortly, Russia failed to capitalize on this. Due to miscommunication, over a third of their infantry remained behind to defend borders and garrisons, while 2/5 of their artillery didn't even get deployed. Additionally, Russian HQ was in the process and planning of assembling their 9th Army near Warsaw and the 10th Army in South Lithuania. That way they could reinforce the offense after securing East Prussia. So after the more rapidly advancing 1st Army led by General Rennenkampf of the Russians crossed into the northeastern frontier, they suffered substantial losses during that cross. Rennenkampf decided to have his men halt, retreat, and resupply to regather themselves and reorganize. During this time, there continued to be much miscommunication and poor planned execution between Generals Rennenkampf and Samsonov. At the Battle of Gumbinnen, I think that's how you pronounce it, Gumbinnen, on August 20th, 1914, the Germans took the advantage that was opened up by Rennenkampf's halt, making use of those German rail networks that I previously mentioned. to get their reinforcements arrived in the east and pursuing Samsonov and the Russians head on. The Russians, who were still struggling with their supplies, logistics, and communications, attempted to cross into the Southern Lakes region, but soon realized that was a mistake, as they could not blindly cross through the treacherous and unfamiliar terrain, which led to disaster for the far-right flanking troops of the Russian army, who were trapped and created a significant opening in the Russian line. At this point, the German 8th Army was being led by General Paul von Hindenburg, who is very important, and his Chief of Staff Ludendorff, who Rori will be talking about in the German section. He replaced the former overly cautious and ineffective General Prittwitz. So following Gumbinnen, while another group in this video set will be discussing the Battle of Tannenberg in detail, it is still a crucial preemptive victory influencing the Masurian Lakes conflict, which makes it worth discussing in our video a little bit as well. So in summary, Tannenberg began on August 24th, but by August 28th, Germany has secured the victory due to a superior leadership, communication, reconnaissance, as well as they had more advanced artillery and machine guns at this point. This Russian defeat, it ended with Samsonov of the Second Army committing suicide in the forest, and in the end, what Germany hoped to quickly achieve in Belgium ended up happening here, so it worked out for them. While Germany secured the region, Russia still had a small strip of Prussia left over they had a little bit of control of. Despite this, Hindenburg and Ludendorff became famous for their victory here.
Now, to introduce our first fighting force, the Germans. And the leader of the Germans is none other than General Paul von Hindenburg. So, a little bit about the guy. He was born in Posen, Prussia, on October 2nd, 1847. Hindenburg was the son of a Prussian military officer who eventually became a government official and was even granted a title of nobility in 1869. You could say that military prowess ran in the family. When he was 19, Hindenburg enlisted in the Prussian army during the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, also known as the 7 Weeks' War. He served as a staff officer during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 and was eventually promoted to lieutenant general. In 1873, he was admitted to the prestigious War Academy in Berlin. This is where he studied before being appointed to the General Staff Corps. In 1885, he was promoted to major and became a member of the German General Staff. Retired in 1911 as the Corps commander, he then moved to a political career, where he was elected president of the Weimar Republic in 1925, re-elected in 1932. He then appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor in 1933. In the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, General Hindenburg commanded the German forces, achieving a decisive victory against the Russian army. Following his earlier triumph in the Battle of Tannenberg, which I mentioned earlier, where he also led the German troops, Hindenburg is considered a key figure behind the success of the German armies in both battles against the Russians during this key stage of World War I. Despite Hindenburg's fame at home, his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff, was the chief architect of these and future Hindenburg victories. You can see the two pictured here together, along with a portrait of Ludendorff himself. So now, a little bit about the guy. He was born in 1865 in Kreuznach, near Posen in Germany. He was trained at Ploen and Lichterfeld and was commissioned into the German infantry in 1883. He quickly gained a reputation as a hardworking and capable officer, so it wasn't long before he was appointed as part of German General Staff. He followed Hindenburg to Berlin as his quartermaster general upon Hindenburg's promotion to the Army Chief of Staff. Ludendorff was known for having very strong militaristic views, believing that war was an acceptable and effective way for a nation to assert their dominance and maintain power. Some say that he saw war as being the norm, while peace was simply the interim. He also felt that the nation should always be prepared for war, with all national resources designed and created to be more efficient in their military. Now, for the German strategy. Hindenburg had aimed to encircle Rennenkampf by exploiting a weak point in the Southern Corps, which had only recently been moved south to reinforce the Second Army at Tannenberg. This corps had become somewhat isolated from the main Russian forces in the west, who had remained passive during the earlier stages of the battle. Before Rennenkampf could fully consolidate his position, Hindenburg and Ludendorff launched a preemptive strike. On September 7th, 4 German corps launched a frontal assault on Russian lines between Heilsberg and Biskopsberg, while simultaneously flanking the enemy from the south. By September 10th, the German 8th Army's envelopment had reached Lick, putting the Russians in a precarious position and threatening to replicate the encirclement scene at Tannenberg. Now, let's do some stats. Here are some photos from during the war, some of what it might have looked like. We have, the first stat is that there's 12 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry. There were 6 line divisions accompanied by 72 cannon and 24 machine guns, plus howitzer support from command. There were 3 reserve divisions with half the light artillery and no machine guns. And finally, there were 3 less effective territorial guard divisions that only had their rifles, made up of older, middle-aged men who had served in units dating back to the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay, so now we'll be moving on to discussing the Russian army leadership and strategy, starting with Paul von Rennenkampf, the general of the First Army. He was a Baltic German noble, statesman, and general of the Russian Imperial Army. As mentioned, he commanded the First Army during the early battles of World War I and the East Prussian campaign. He was the last commander of the Vilna military district. He gained this early renown and recognition during the Boxer Rebellion and Russo-Japanese War. After suppressing the Cheetah Republic during the 1905 Russian Revolution, he rose through the ranks and eventually became a general. Despite his impressive victories at the Battle of Gumbinnen, he was dismissed following his defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, as we have discussed. Interestingly, since he had such a involvement in many different revolts and revolutions, he ended up being executed by the Bolsheviks during the Red Terror of 1918. Okay, moving on to another influential figure of this battle and Russian leadership, we have Yakov Zelensky. He was a Russian general and military strategist who played a key role in the early stages of the Great War. He served as the chief of general staff and later as commander of the Northwest front during the Russians' invasion of East Prussia, as we've been talking about. Zelensky was responsible for the planning of Russia's rapid mobilization, maybe too rapid, but his strategic mistakes contributing to the losses at Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes. He attempted to blame Rennenkampf for his faults, but in the end he was still fired and dismissed. His death is unclear. Regarding the Russian strategy during the Battle of Masurian Lakes, Russians' first plan of attack started as Rennenkampf and Zelensky's forces advanced through the Insenberg Gap between Königsberg and the lake region. During this advance, Zelensky made the mistake of separating the main Russian forces through the impossible terrain at the request of their French allies, who were wanting a quick early offensive. As a result, the armies approached uncoordinated and they remained separated before any sort of logistical base or operations could be established. No communications, no way to get back to each other through the terrain, no operations to meet at, nothing. The Russians were worn down by the Germans and picked off by the rapid march and vicious counteroffensive that they had. So, marching through the night and day of September 9th and 10th, attempting to protect the retreat quicker than the Germans could keep up, the Russians made their counterattack in the center of the line on the 10th, driving back the Germans and delaying their advance, which ensured their escape back to Russia, and Rennenkampf's rear guard prepared to fight one final battle. Here on the map here we have Rennenkampf's First Army, the line, the Germans, Hindenburg's forces, and this is on, I believe this map is from the 9th and 10th, and the next map is from the 14th. So on this map of the 10th we have the Russian forces where they're meeting on the line, and you can see where he's originally at, and then protecting where he goes to protect his retreat, and when they meet there in the center for the, I guess, upcoming final battle. Due to Rennenkampf and Zelensky's poor communications and decision-making, no move was made to aid Samsonov at Tannenberg. Instead, they resumed their slow, steady advance along the line. Russian HQ at this point had considerably built up the 1st and 10th armies and ordered Rennenkampf to attack on the 14th. This was the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. After this defeat, Rennenkampf had no choice but to pull all of his divisions from Prussia and retreat along with the 10th Army. And I have, besides the notes there, here is another map of the 14th, and you can see this was their position the 10th, this was their position by the 11th, and this was their position by the 13th as they were retreating out of Prussia, with the Germans falling behind. The Russian offense. All right. Now, regarding the details and numbers of the Russian military at this battle, the Russian offense consisted of an estimated 150,000 to 300,000 soldiers, accompanied by around 150 heavy guns, based on German data that they captured. The Russian First Army was made up of an infantry division, was made up of 9 infantry divisions and 5 cavalry divisions, with the specific ones listed on the screen. The Russian 10th Army, they were a reserve force that wouldn't actually reach its full potential until later in the war. Though during the Battle of the Masurian Lakes, it was initially made up of the 22nd Army Corps, the 3rd Siberian Corps, and the 1st Turkestan Army Corps.
Okay, now for the moral consequences. The first battle in the Masurian Lakes had significant moral consequences for both sides. For Russia, it was a major blow to morale, as their defeat and retreat exposed weaknesses in their command and their strategy. This fueled the disillusionment that would contribute to the Russian Revolution. On the other hand, the Germans gained a morale boost, with their victory solidifying the leadership of Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff and reinforcing confidence in their military strategy. This battle also led to civilian suffering in the contested regions, with both armies employing harsh measures. Strategically, it shifted the momentum of the Eastern Front, leaving Russia with a difficult path ahead and cementing German dominance in East Prussia for the time being.
Okay, as I'm wrapping things up here with our conclusion, summary, and just overall takeaway from the battle, I have some pictures here of the Russian cavalry, probably what Rennenkampf and his cavalry units, that's probably what they would look like crossing the Masurian Lakes area. And then down here we have the German 8th Army, top lieutenants and leaders, probably Ludendorff and Hindenburg is in there somewhere, overseeing the battlefield. So unlike any of the static warfare on the Western Front, the German 8th Army achieved massive significant victories here in East Prussia, dealing early heavy blows to the Russians and largely eliminating the immediate threat to the Germans for the time. This campaign commanded Hindenburg's reputation, or it cemented his reputation as a German national hero, as well as providing promotion and connection opportunities for Ludendorff, who became his quartermaster general. This battle helped shape Germany's offensive strategy on the active Eastern Front later in the war, and contrastingly, the Russian leaders experienced defamation and embarrassment, along with the Russian Empire now falling behind in this great global conflict. And that was our presentation.